Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's SANS webcast, the game changer in due diligence and M&As, cybersecurity maturity assessments, sponsored by Security. My name is Carol Auth of SANS. Today's featured speakers are John Pescatore, SANS Director of Emerging Security Trends. He will be moderating today's webcast. Reuven Aronishvili, Founder and CEO of Security. Eran Gorev, President Israel and Senior Operating Partner at Francisco Partners, and Petter Vederholm, Global Head of IT Strategy at EQT. If during the webcast you have any questions for our presenters, please enter them into the questions window located on the GoToWebinar interface at any time. Please note that this webcast is being recorded, and a copy of the slides and recording of this webcast will be available for viewing later today and can be found on the SANS registration page. And with that, I'd like to turn the webcast over to our presenters.
Thanks, Carol, and welcome everyone. I'm John Pescatore with SANS. Welcome to another SANS webinar. I think we have a real interesting one here today. Happy Earth Day to everybody out there, wherever you are on Earth. I hope you're safe and healthy and emerging from the past year or so of what we've all gone through, and business continues. Cybersecurity continues to be critical to business doing business. And we're going to focus today on the cybersecurity assessment. Things are particularly related to companies that are going through mergers and acquisitions, looking at acquiring companies, looking at being acquired. But I'm just going to sort of start at a higher level. Let me give you an idea of what we're going to go through here. So I'm going to kick things off, and I'm going to do a sort of start more at a third-party risk management view, and then we'll sort of zero in on the merger and acquisitions aspect of things. Then we're going to have some great discussions. I'll start with talking to Ruby, the CEO and founder of Security, about what they've seen as their company is focused on that area in particular. And then we'll have Ron and Petter join in the discussion, talk about some particular aspects that the investment community is focused on as they've evaluated companies. And I think this is an important topic, whether you're in a company, running a company, or involved in a company that's potentially being acquired, or looking at your supply chain and your vendors and your partners as they get acquired. And we'll sort of go through some key things there. So as we go along, if you have any questions, to echo what Carol said, and I'm in that question window on the right-hand side of your screen or wherever your toolbar is. Some we may be able to get to as we go along. We'll save time at the end for any we didn't get to as we go along. And if you are watching a recorded version of this webinar, at the end, I'll give you an email address you can send your questions to, and we'll get you answers afterwards from the right person. So with that, let's get started. So I think it's pretty obvious that business is pretty complex these days. There's really very few cases of companies that have no suppliers, have no business partners, have a supply chain of just themselves and the customer. And there's lots of complicated pieces of software and appliances and hardware and web services and applications that make up that supply chain. The bad guys have obviously figured that out. We've seen loads of attacks against whether it's SolarWinds or Microsoft Exchange of key components that it's in use in many companies. And we've seen, I'll give you a few other examples, and we'll go through some other examples of this happening over the years in compromised companies that are being acquired or looking at being acquired. So both bad guys and investors have figured out it's important to look at the weaknesses, vulnerabilities, and overall cybersecurity of the supply chain. This has gotten really more complicated over the years. We used to talk about third-party risk management. I've started calling it nth party, and we'll go through a couple graphic slides. You know, the idea being that the company whose critical application I use in a transaction, they wrote the software, but that software is composed of multiple pieces of software and services and runs on some cloud service provider and may pull in information from some fourth or fifth or sixth party. It's gotten very complex. We've seen recognition at the board level, at the CEO level, at the financial world level, that cybersecurity is a pretty key component of the value of companies that are going to be acquired or go public or considered as key suppliers. The risks are enormous if a company is compromised. The costs of just dealing with the incident are huge, and all too often it takes companies way too long to discover the compromise. It can go on for years in some smaller companies. And we've seen examples in the past of companies that essentially have had to close their doors because their intellectual property was gone. They had no more secret sauce because the compromise went on so long. So for too long, security teams weren't necessarily even involved in the assessment of potential merger and acquisition targets or even supply chain partners, business partners and supply chain decisions. I think we've recognized in the past couple of years how critical that is. But we're not going to see many companies be able to staff up the security team to have a totally dedicated, large enough team to really do a thorough job of this. Like every other area of cybersecurity, we need to look at force multiplier tools that can enable our skilled security people to move quickly and do these type of assessments. Because if you think about it, over the years, security has been sort of the gatekeeper. And should we allow this company to connect to us? The business units want this company to plug into our databases, our ordering systems, and they need to know now. We can't wait 6 months or a year to do an assessment. So it's not just doing the assessment, it's doing this at the speed of doing business. And that's where we need these force multiplier type tools that we'll drill down on a bit. So kind of the big example in the merger and acquisition world, at least that you can find public data on, is back in, what was it, 2017 or so, I guess. Verizon acquired Yahoo and America Online's assets, and they had an initial price of 4.5 billion. And almost immediately afterwards, it came out that pretty much every email address Yahoo ever had been compromised, and the huge costs of dealing with that. And that immediately reduced the acquisition cost by $350 million. If I remember right, there was another $350 million that got reduced after that as well, that when other things came out. So that was a big, almost a 15% impact overall on the value of the price there. We had a SANS CISO summit where the CISO at a US, or actually a global auto parts supplier company, talked about their company's decision to acquire a South American-based auto parts supplier, and the security team was involved and luckily did do a very intensive on-site audit and found that the acquisition targets point of sale ordering was already compromised, and that there was no way that company could be allowed to be integrated in with the acquiring company's systems. It was just too risky. The acquisition still went forward. I don't think any public numbers came out on any change in valuation, but for business reasons, the acquisition still went forward. But it was a good 6 months, closer to a year, before they fully integrated that acquisition into the same ordering system, same logistics system that the rest of the company used. So obviously, there's a major cost to maintaining those separate systems for longer periods of time than the initial roadmap projected when they had not done that thorough cybersecurity assessment. So that's sort of an example of, you can find some public data out there. I think it's key that when we look at this, what the attackers are trying to do is find the weak link in the chain. And it's a really complex web of chains out there when you think about it. When you're trying to evaluate the security of an organization, whether it's an acquisition target, whether it's a supplier or business partner, there's many different levels. I use this NIST diagram modified a little bit here. There may be external service providers who use external service providers, who use cloud service providers. It might end up that there's actually 14 different organizations involved in what eventually to you becomes that one product or service from that organization you're acquiring. Another complex thing is who's acquired who over the years and what this company really is. The example I've used for many years, one of the first application security companies, application security scanners, came out of Israel. It was a company called Sanctum many years ago. And just for various reasons, it changed its name to Perfecto. Then it got acquired by Watchfire. Then IBM acquired Watchfire. And here in the past couple of years, HCL took over the Watchfire part of IBM, AppScan part of IBM, and I think also the Big Fix part. So now there's HCL AppScan that many years ago might have been Sanctum or Perfecto or Watchfire. So there's also issues about, as companies do get acquired, get merged into the acquirer, what happens to their security. Did it go up? Hopefully it did. Did it go down? So it's not just the existing connections, it's also the history of those connections and what's really being done versus what's being talked about or advertised as far as the cybersecurity level of the overall organization. So when we look at the financial world, they've had the longest and most intense experience in investigating the risk of third-party companies, whether it's companies they're looking at investing in or funding or bringing onto their portfolios, or business partners of their own. They've been in a regulated world for many years, and there's obviously lots of critical financial reasons for doing a good job of this. So here's an example of large financial organizations have processes like you see on the screen, and they might have a staff of 10 to 20 full-time people that do nothing but third-party risk management. Obviously, that's out of the scope of many companies, probably most companies outside of the Fortune 100, say. So as I mentioned, those key processes and those force multiplier approaches to doing this at scale, rapidly, efficiently, and effectively and accurately is really key. And again, the ability to do that spans lots of different disciplines. So when I've looked across this at my career at both almost 14 years I spent at Gartner, and the last 8 or 9 years here at Sands, when I look at the companies doing this type of thing right, there's some sort of key building blocks that come out of it. The first is the quality of the security team, the skills in the team, and both their ability and the company's willingness to make sure they're involved in whether it's procurement assessments, merger and acquisition assessments, making sure cybersecurity is considered and accurately assessed. Obviously, that has to take place in the overall company's framework of rigorous contractual and compliance investigation of partners and acquisition targets, because one of the key things is knowing what your suppliers out there are, knowing where acquisitions and mergers are happening. There's a lot of companies out there that have centralized control of this. There's a lot of very distributed companies or federated companies that this is often happening at the business unit level in large ways and small ways. And the security team has to be able to work across the company and be same as we need an accurate asset inventory of the servers and PCs we're protecting. We have to have an accurate inventory of what third-party acquisitions or partnerships or supplier arrangements the company's entering into. And I think we've learned the hard way for over many years that compliance does not equal security. Something can be compliant to all known industry and financial standards, and the next day it gets compromised because something changed. I think every time you see a breach, a credit card breach, that company was complying with the PCI security standards, but it still got breached. So audits are not enough. We've got to go beyond that. Well, we sort of trust you because you were audited, but we definitely need to verify things. And there's different levels of things, from the simple self-assessment questionnaires to the use of external risk rating services or shared assessments that your vertical industry or your ISAC may have done, to active testing on your own, to various forms of continuous monitoring and tools to provide mixes of all of those. And then I think one key success element I've seen is whatever the security team does develop, whatever sort of dashboard or reporting they do use to help make these decisions, the ability to extend those views out to the business units or upwards to the board and the CXOs so that they can have sort of a continuous view and then say, well, this one looks okay, security, are we okay? Or this one is definitely not even worth considering. We don't even need to go any further at this point. So that can definitely help to speed things along. And finally, what I like to call closing the loop, which is as you learn things about your suppliers, your acquisition targets, and either recommend or influence them to do mitigation, that you begin to sort of feed these things forward everywhere in the supply chain to the business units. Here's things to look for when you're considering business partners to team with, or here's things to look at when you're considering companies to add to our portfolio. Sort of close that loop and get that early in the stage of companies formation that they're considering cybersecurity critical to their eventual valuation or their ability to become key business partners or suppliers. It's sort of like the auto industry learned that years ago, you know, push quality up into the suppliers as far up the food chain as you can, and the benefits cascade downwards. So with that, let me ask Ruby to turn on his microphone, tell us a little bit about Psy and what they do and where they came from, and then we'll start the discussion.
Thank you, John. So I'll start very quickly with a personal introduction, and then I'll introduce Psy quickly. and we can jump in. So as John mentioned, I'm Ruby Ornashvili. I'm the founder and the CEO of Sai Security. My professional career starts way back in the Israeli army as part of an academic excellence program that is called Atidim in Israel. I've done my B Science and M Science degree in computer science and math, and then joined the cybersecurity unit as a very young and let's say non-experienced, without any experience, let's say, officer in the Israeli army. Very quickly, I got the responsibility with my team members to build the Israeli Red Team, which was a huge challenge at the time. We didn't have any clue of how that should look like, what are the objectives, what we are trying to achieve, and so on and so forth. Very quickly, we got into a very interesting structure that I think was proven to be very effective for the Israeli army and still one of the leading capabilities that we have here as a nation. Then after 7 years of a very interesting service, I decided to continue with a civilian career and founded Sai. Today we have in Sai around 100 employees. 80 of them are professionals, that means cybersecurity experts working either in the R&D team or in the Red Team that we have. We also have an information sharing platform in which we exchange information in the highest level with different cybersecurity experts worldwide. As a company, Sai actually developed a very interesting approach for cybersecurity. That is like an approach that includes 3 main phases. The first phase is what we call the visibility phase. We do security assessments in a very comprehensive way with a unique approach that maybe we'll discuss later to actually expose the cybersecurity risk level or risk situation of the organization. Then we take the organization through a risk quantification process in which we are able to say very clearly what is the likelihood of each and every one of the attack vectors or scenarios that we've demonstrated to happen, and then what would be also the potential business impact or the exposure, the financial exposure for the organization based on those specific items. The last and final stage in every, let's say, cycle of or every iteration of this specific process, we do mitigation optimization based on a mathematical algorithm that is quite sophisticated to actually take the context into consideration, the risk for mitigation, so the risk of the vulnerabilities, the cost for mitigation, and the potential exposure. Measure all of this in and actually based on those parameters to come up with the most cost-efficient program for the organization to actually mitigate the actual risk. The gentlemen that I have here with me were part of the journey in different parts of Sai. We've done multiple engagements together, and those are really 2 of the most respectful professionals in the industry that I had the honor to work with. And with them, we got into a very clear understanding that the M&A processes that we see today are going as a trend more and more through cybersecurity, which was a very small and insignificant part in the past of M&A processes. And today we see that it actually takes a very significant part, or this is a parameter that is really taken seriously as part of those specific processes. For that, we actually developed a capability inside to support due diligence processes, portfolio management capabilities, providing more in-depth capabilities for the portfolio companies to really improve their cybersecurity capabilities, and above all, of course, working with the private equity to make sure that the assets, that those are the portfolio companies, are actually able to maintain a level of security that is not only good to protect their own capabilities, but also to be ready for a next acquisition or let's say IPO that is maybe planned for this specific company. I'm really happy to be here, and thank you very much for setting this one up. And I'm very happy or excited to have the discussion with Eran and with Peter, my good friends that are here in the call as well. So back to you, John.
Okay, let me ask you a few questions, Ruby, and then we'll open things up to Ron and Peter. So you mentioned iteration. I mentioned compliance does not equal security. Most compliance regimes tend to work on a yearly cycle. When you're looking at companies, smaller portfolio companies, or companies that might be targets of mergers and acquisitions, is there something that happens faster than a yearly cycle, or what do you recommend for the sort of frequency of assessments?
Yeah, so from our point of view, we really believe in the continuous approach, right? So doing something once a year, that's of course a good start, but definitely insufficient. When we think about cybersecurity threats and IT or organizational, let's say, landscape, the pace of changes in the threat landscape and in the internal environment doesn't really allow a situation in which you test yourself only once a year. So from our point of view, the continuous approach to cybersecurity, whether it's assessment, mitigation, risk evaluation, this is really a necessity that every organization needs to take into consideration. I'll say more than that. You cannot start thinking about, let's say, exit strategy when you are about to exit the company, right? If you don't build that by design, when you start the processes, right? So that's something that we'll discuss also later. But from our point of view, the earlier you start with this specific integration of cybersecurity into the design, architecture, and considerations from the top, let's say from the board level to the last employee in the organization, the earliest that you are able to introduce those cybersecurity considerations, the better you'll be prepared for this kind of exit. So from our point of view, continuous is the key word.
Okay, I do periodic board security briefings, and we at SANS have done some deep drill down and talking to boards and CIOs and CISOs and about how they communicate. And sort of a common feedback from board members is security teams and managers and CIOs often speak a totally different language from the board. So particularly around M&A, how do you recommend security teams or CISOs and CEOs quantify risks to the board? Is it strictly financial? How do they get across the magnitude and the quantity of the risk in meaningful ways to the board?
That's a great question. I mean, in general, making data accessible, actionable, and let's say readable or understandable for management is a key item in communication between the technical teams and board of directors or managers. So in general, when we speak about organizational risk, we try to avoid the technical language, or in other words, the how we are able to do that. It's more about what would be the consequences for the business. That's something that the managers or the organization definitely can understand, and this is their bread and butter. And second, when we talk about quantification of the risk, in the end, we are trying to correlate it to specific financial loss, reputational damage, and other things that are really in the core, in the heart of the organization to understand it. We try not to overwhelm the organization with a lot of details, be very specific, very clear, give a number, give a specific statement, and based on that, you are able to actually win the attention of the other side and make sure that you are very clear with your statement. That means specific risks that are relevant to the organization, the potential loss associated with that, and what is the recommendation to go ahead and really reduce the risk. From my point of view, that's everything that you need. You need to say it in a very clear, actionable, and practical way. Theoretical risk and so on, that's something that you should avoid. Just, the scare or the fear factor that cybersecurity specialists, let's say, tend to use. That's something that, from my point of view, in a way is a little bit overused, and you need to be fact-based and risk-based in your approach. That means to provide facts and not only theoretical threats to management. So from our point of view, clear facts, numbers, and clear statements regarding what are the risks and what are the associated, let's say, consequences to the organization based on that.
So we had a question from the audience here. So can you give an idea of what the sort of ballpark overhead of this represents for companies that might undergo these assessments? How much involvement does the security team have? How much time? Is there cost involved? How should they plan for how much overhead this is going to take?
So it really depends on what you're trying to do. But our approach, for example, if you talk about SCI, we are trying to be very, let's say, self-contained. So we are working, of course, with the team, but trying to keep at minimum the operational cost to the other side. That means, and my colleagues here can speak about that from their experience. But from our point of view, we are coming to the organization and we are taking the entire operational effort on our side, and we communicate with the organization only to understand better the quantification of their part of the risk and to actually make sure that they are aware of everything that we are doing in the organization, so they are not surprised if something, for example, they start to see something that behaves differently or abnormally, and then I don't want them to be surprised. Then we communicate with them, of course. But generally speaking, really the effort is quite limited. We quantify it usually as 5 or 10% of an FTE that is associated to us or work together with us in order to be able to maintain the entire process.
Okay, with that, I want to open things up to our panel. I seem to have lost my screen here, Carol. I don't know if Carol's still on there or not, but let me toss things first. I'll ask our two panelists from the investment community to weigh in here. Oh, there we go. We'll move forward a slide here and see what we can get things moving again. There we go. So we're going to get the viewpoint of the investors here. And let me toss things first over to Ron. Can you introduce yourself? And then I know you've been involved in a specific instance where there was some investigation that dramatically changed the valuation or the risk outlook of an acquirer. So can you go first, Ron?
Sure. Thanks, John, and thanks, Ruby, for having me. So I've been with Francisco Partners for the last 8 years. I head our firm's activities in Israel, and I'm also a member of the firm's value creation group called Francisco Partners Consulting. In terms of my background prior to FP, to Francisco Partners, I'm an operator. I also have a computer science degree, started in computer science many years ago. I was a software engineer, moved into sales and marketing. Later in my career, worked for large corporations like Digital Equipment, way back when in the 90s, and then Amdocs, and later on Nice Systems, and after that Alvarian, and then I joined FP. Yeah, married to Ruti. I have 3 wonderful daughters, and I'm glad to be on this call today. John, would you like me to share the particular story you mentioned now, or let Peter introduce himself?
Well, why don't you go through your story and then we'll introduce Peter.
Okay, my story. So my story, so to speak, goes back 2 years ago, and it exemplifies, demonstrates the importance of some of the points that both John and Ruby touched on, such as the continuous security approach versus periodic or kind of random check-ins. So we own the company. I won't mention the company's name. I'll just say Francisco Partners is a tech-focused, exclusively technology-focused private equity firm, 25 billion in assets under management, started 21 years ago. The team is based mostly out of San Francisco in the US, but we have offices in London and in Israel as well. And that was one of our portfolio companies that was doing very well, and everybody was happy. And there was a strategic, for us, a strategic would be a company, not a financial investor. So a strategic that knew the company had an interest and expressed an interest in exploring an acquisition of that business. And we're talking a business worth over $1 billion. So, quite meaningful for us. The discussions went very well, and we were getting close to signing an actual document, an actual purchase agreement. And then we got a call one morning, and we heard from the strategic that they had a team, think of it as a red team or a pen testing team. They had a team that was testing, actually without our knowledge, to be honest, the security of that particular target company, our portfolio company that we were discussing a sale of to that particular strategic. And it turns out that the strategic found various vulnerabilities, various loopholes, various risks associated with that particular company, to the extent that they were not comfortable signing the purchase agreement. And needless to say, as a financial investor, whether you're a venture capital firm or a private equity firm, you invest in a company with the hope and the plan and the projection to exit this particular investment within a number of years. You invest at a certain valuation, Hopefully you help the team create some value, and then you sell at a much higher valuation and generate the profit for your limited partners and your own team. And so to get all of a sudden a no from a strategic that was about to acquire the business and was a very logical acquirer of that particular business came as a shock to all of us. And that was the wake-up call that we probably needed as a team. And Ruby mentioned that cybersecurity used to be, an item on someone's checklist in the past, but not something that was necessarily taken very seriously. And John, you shared the example of Verizon and Yahoo from a few years ago. But for us, although we knew of cybersecurity risks and we actually made investments in cybersecurity companies, this particular example or this particular situation really woke us up and changed our entire approach, which I'll touch upon a little later in our discussion. But we were given specific feedback by that strategic as to what they found out. There was a security team at the company, at our portfolio company. There was a CISO, and we reached out to Ruby. That we've known Ruby for a number of years and thought extremely highly of him and the team and the platform they developed. And so we reached out and engaged them to help us, first of all, assess from our perspective, and I mean including cybersecurity, who came as our partner to this, assess the actual situation of the company. So we took the feedback from the potential acquirer, worked with Ruby and the team, and that went on for a number of months. It turned out that the specific acquirer did a very good job and uncovered a number of challenges and issues that we were not aware of, and nor was the in-house security team aware of. So with Ruby's help, with his team's help, we addressed and fixed the issues that were presented to us. And luckily, a number of months later, it took us almost 6 months or so, we finished with a successful transaction with that acquirer, the same strategic player that still was interested in the business and continued to test the security situation of that company. And as the SI team, with the help of the in-house security team, were taking the necessary measures to address the issues, they became comfortable and ultimately signed the purchase agreement, and we sold the company. So it was to summarize, it was a very binary situation, not just a valuation related discussion, take a few $1 million off and we'll buy the business. It was a plain no, we may never come back and buy the business, but we'll certainly not do it unless you guys address successfully all the issues.
Okay, Eran just talked about things very particular on the sort of smaller vendors, targets of mergers, acquisitions. But if you think about it, for the past several weeks, months, we've seen major security vendors in the news for serious vulnerabilities in their products, whether it's Pulse Secure or Palo Alto Networks or Cisco or Fortinet. And you think about the smaller, less mature companies, how important it is to expose that. So let me bring Petter into the discussion. Petter, can you introduce yourself and then maybe give us your thoughts on how best to companies can get these sort of the business relevant aspects of cybersecurity of acquisition or portfolio companies to come out?
Sure, thanks a lot, John. So and thanks Ruby for having me here. So I'm Petter Weiderholm. I'm global head of IT strategy at EQT in a team called Digital Business Development. So we're a center of excellence supporting our deal teams and our portfolio companies. I've been with EQT for 5 years. Started as the CIO here, so I'm an operator as well, similar to Eran. Before EQT, I was at Spotify for 5 years, where I headed up global IT as well as people operations. I'm a software engineer from the start, and I'm also very happy to be serving on the board of SciSec and working with Ruby and the team there. So EQT, we're a fairly large private equity. So we own around 80 larger companies and around 50 investments in venture and growth companies. So it's a significant amount of companies. And back in 2017, we started to design. This was after we started to use SciSec internally at EQT, and really starting to figure out what does cybersecurity mean for our portfolio companies and our fund performance and valuations and so on. So in 2017, started to design a program for all our portfolio companies, and in 2018 started to roll this out. So I've got quite some experience now supporting all the portfolio companies, as well as also doing cybersecurity due diligence in the for all of the deals that we look at. I would say, and I think, John, you touched on it in the beginning in your intro speech, this ability to communicate properly to a board what does this risk mean, right? And this was the fundamental objective that we set out when we designed our cybersecurity program. Make sure that cybersecurity risks are treated the same way, with the same methodologies and so on, and same severity and significance as all the other risks that a company and the management team is used to manage. Whether it's your supply chain risk that you also talk through, your customer credit risk, or foreign exchange risk, or whatever other types of risks that you manage. Cybersecurity risk cannot be an issue that is handled by someone in IT, right? And that the CEO and the board and the CFO and so on does not care about. And this, I think, we've been very successful. So one of the things, I think Ruby touched on this as well, is what we try to be is really demystify it, speak common language. For this reason, for example, I really like the NIST framework. We use that quite a lot. Because it really invites also non-technical people to understand and reason about, okay, what will an investment do for us as a company? What capability will that give us? Oh, we're not so good at detecting. Okay, let's invest some money and we get better at detecting. You don't need to be an expert to realize that that's a good thing for you, or you can have actually a reasonable conversation about what about that versus protection, or versus something else, right? And you can engage the business in a really good way and compare this risk toward other risks, right? So this is what we've been doing, and I think it really, to me, it's about, Aaron's story is quite exciting with this sort of very binary, right? We couldn't sell the company. Then of course that's very drastic. But in many ways, I see the companies that are very good at managing cybersecurity and are able to prove that they are good at doing it. There's a quality aspect to that, right? And you all know, if you're going to go out and buy something that has high quality, you're going to pay a bit more, right? And this is an area where I think, security teams and CISOs and so on really can help to build the enterprise value in their companies and show that quality of this asset, right? So, I mean, this is what I wanted to open with, but yeah, back to you, John.
Okay, you mentioned something I want to ask our other panelists to weigh in on. I mentioned the work SANS has done with boards, and not only did they say often CISOs don't speak the same language, they also said it seems like each quarter they're speaking a different language. They aren't consistently reporting threats or vulnerabilities or strategies in a consistent way. So Petter mentioned the NIST framework. He's a fan of that. Aaron, Ruby, is that common, the NIST framework in use? Are there other frameworks out there that you recommend or you've seen used to express risk and status consistently?
So Ruby, if you don't mind, I'll go first. We employ the CIS framework. CIS is the Center for Internet Security. They have a top 20 controls kind of framework, and we've implemented that across our portfolio. So every portfolio company, to ensure consistency of terminology and metrics and such, John, to your point, about making sure people understand what they're looking at and are able to effectively assess and determine any actions necessary. We ask each one of our portfolio companies to report based on this framework on a quarterly basis whenever we have a board session with them. We ask that security be a continuous process, as we mentioned earlier. And it's a framework that once you master, and any framework is as good as the usage of it. So once you master a certain framework and you use it consistently and over time, then you can actually look back and determine, assess the level of work that a company, together with support teams like cybersecurity, has done, and whether it's well positioned for a potential exit or not.
Ruby, any thoughts?
Yeah, so I totally agree with Peter and with Eran here. But from my point of view, every kind of framework that has the 4 items, right? First, consistent. Second, actionable. Third, structure. That means has all the relevant components integrated in it. And most important, measurable. When you have those 4 components, this can be a framework that you can go with and implement in your organization. I can tell you that those frameworks usually can be mapped to each other, right? So those are not different from each other very significantly. But the point is really to be consistent with those measurements and to be able to measure that over and over and over again. If you have every quarter you have a different reporting from your CISO, yeah, you are in a problem, right? That's something that shows very clearly that things are not repeatable, things are not maybe measurable in the right way, and definitely not actionable, because you cannot change your plan every quarter. That's something that will be very different. But from my point of view, every kind of framework that has those parameters can work.
Yeah, the NIST framework itself in the back has a mapping to just about every other framework. But the example we've used, Consumer Energy is a large power company, and Jim Beachy's the CISO and been a friend of Sands for many years. And he showed us his reporting that he used the controls to base it on. And the word came back from the board. That's the first time we've heard a security briefing make sense. And they actually made the security budget sort of part of routine maintenance. So it didn't have to fight for money each year. It was just, we trim the trees each year to make sure the power lines don't go down. We do these cybersecurity things each year to make sure we stay secure. We got a good audience question here I want to toss out to the panel. So here's the question, and we'll see who wants to take a shot. Aside from a discovered breach or a likely breach during the diligence process, are there other red flags you would consider from cybersecurity perspective around maturity or their staff or technical controls? What else would you consider red flags besides obvious evidence of a breach or possible breach?
I can give that a shot. First of all, I wouldn't say that any of those things actually are a red flag. You have to compare it to all the other risks, right? So the way when you let me actually back up a bit. I joined EQT 5 years ago, and before that, M&A was to me a bit of a mystery. But and I'm sure there are people on the call that haven't been through an M&A process. So if I just share how this works quickly, like you look at a company and you start to understand it. Do you like the market? Do you like the specific company in that market? And then it goes to a decision from an investment committee that and off you go. And a very big part of this is, of course, to value the risk, right? What are the risk reward of this particular deal? And all those indicators tells you something and plays into that. But there are also other risks, maybe customer concentration or some disruptive technology might be coming and so on, right? So cybersecurity in itself, very rarely, I would say, is a super red flag, but it helps to paint the picture of what is the quality of this asset that we're looking at. So I can say, for example, in one case, we started to find, evidence of quite a lot of breaches and poor discipline discipline in the tech operations, right? Easy to spot this even with a simple passive scan, right? Most of the tooling that's available just tells you, look, they have some unpatched thing here. It's been unpatched for the last 90 days. You're like, okay, what's going on with the company? Where's the discipline? Where's the operational excellence in the company? And it starts to paint that picture of this is probably not a great asset, and we will need to start to invest quite a lot to get it to where we want to be. So you know, if you find an active breach, I think there's another problem the way we have acted, and actually I have another story about that. We were in a process about you know, really about to sign and found an active breach ongoing. Our job then, of course, is not to walk away, but we help the company to fight off that, right, by sending in the vendors and you know, Ruby and the team here to help deal with it. And then after that, you make a decision: should we invest in the company or not? So that would be my.
Yeah. I can add on top of that we've seen in our you know, in our history several things that were actually red flags that were not cybersecurity breaches. Let me give you an example. Let's assume that you have a technology company, right? And during our assessment, we managed to identify a vulnerability that is like an architecture level vulnerability that now, in order to mitigate it, right, the cost is so high to mitigate it, right, that it's just, you know, the value for the deal is not there. If you need to invest a significant amount of money in order to mitigate that, or practically to build a product from scratch, that's something that wouldn't fly, right? We had other situations in which we've seen that the company, as part of the technology, is using data in a way that is, let's say, against the trends in regulations of privacy. It was in 2018. We went with one of the pharmaceutical companies worldwide. They wanted to acquire a specific company, and the entire business model was based on the fact that they are able to collect data on patients, right? This is a healthcare company, data on patients in a way that was really against the trend in regulation like GDPR and CCPA and so on and so forth. So this is something that was also a red flag, because if that's the technology of the company, why would you buy that, right? So there are several items that can go against the business strategy that comes from cybersecurity weaknesses or technology weaknesses that can be leveraged on a later stage. It doesn't have to be an active breach, you know. So usually a deal breaker would be something that either goes to an illegal point, doing something illegal, or that the technology itself has something, let's say a technology or cybersecurity that is so big that you cannot overcome that with specific or basic mitigation program. So from our point of view, there might be a lot of red flags in this kind of process, and not only an active breach. At least that's my point of view.
Okay. I'll tell you, I often get the question from boards and others, what sort of questions should we ask to get a feel for, do we have a security problem? And I often tell them, look, whenever you get a chance to talk to anybody outside of the CISO, ask them what they're doing about security. If it's the COO, what's happening in operations? If it's customer support, if it's somewhere else, if it's the CIO, where is security being focused on within the IT organization or the app dev side? If it's the security organization's the only one talking about security at this vendor or this target, then they're sort of trying to spackle security on versus build security in. And that to me is always a red flag, or at least a red flag that says drill deeper. Sort of like when you buy a house. The paint may be very fresh in the house, but did they just paint over the mildew, or did they fix the problem? So let's see, we're just about nearing the end of our time. So SANS does a lot of these webinars, and the SANS community, I think it's important for us to connect the SANS community with the technology solution providers, and for this two-way dialogue, for you to know what they can offer and for you to give them feedback on what can best meet your needs. So what I'd like to do is, before we run out of time here, ask Ruby to just go through a little bit about what they offer and what their platform is for doing these type of risk assessments.
Yeah, so we've developed a platform that is called Hiver. The concept of Hiver is really to have different capabilities from the asset discovery point of view, vulnerability and security assessment integrated in one platform with risk quantification and mitigation planning and optimization that are integrated in the platform out of the box. This specific capability can support multiple, let's say, solutions for either venture arms, private equities, or companies that want to improve their cybersecurity posture, whether it's for due diligence, exit readiness, cybersecurity improvement, or just to be able to be on top of, let's say, the cybersecurity risk. We provide all of those capabilities out of the box with the Hiver platform. So the 1, 2, 3 that you see here, this is from our point of view really the approach to identify the risk, quantify the risk, reduce the risk, and do that on a continuous basis, while making sure that the organization is not only aware of the risk, not only able to quantify the risk, but actually solves, mitigate, and improve the cybersecurity level of the organization in a measurable, visible, and actionable way that can be then be visible to potential buyers, partners, or any kind of customer that will want in a way to see what is the cybersecurity level of this specific organization. I'm more than happy to take questions also at a later stage with regards to how we do that, what are the capabilities, but I will say 2 things that are important here. Everything that we do is fact-based. We believe in scientific approach, nothing that is guesstimation or hunch that you work based on. So we believe that facts, numbers, analysis of data, that's the really data-driven approach, that's really the way to do that. And the second thing that I would like to say is that we try to avoid any kind of assumptions, right? If we come to an organization and we want to evaluate the situation, we want to provide the most, let's say, realistic and cost-efficient solution to the organization, we will do that in the most realistic way possible, while really mimicking the attacker in the right way, mimicking really the different threat sources, and going through the entire process while understanding the organizational needs, protection objectives, and of course the wanted to-be state from cybersecurity standpoint, which is by itself not an easy question to understand what is the wanted to-be state. But that's for a different discussion.
Okay, we've gone through a lot of questions from the audience here. I want to give Aaron and Petter one last chance. Anything you want to bring out that came up that we didn't get across? So why don't you go first, Aaron?
Yeah, so just some words of advice to the audience, assuming these are mostly CISOs. I would say that you guys should expect not just your board, but more and more over time, your CEO or your COO, your CFO, to bring up cybersecurity as an important item. Now, you may view this obviously as a positive, which I would encourage you to do, but the reason I'm mentioning this is that I've come across CISOs that think of outside vendors, third parties, service providers like Security and others as a potential threat. And I think, if for no other reason, and this has nothing to do with Ruby inviting me to the session, I think people need to realize, and CISOs need to understand, that there will always be a limit to how professional and how much knowledge their in-house team can have. That's not to obviously undermine any such particular team. And relying on people whose sole job in life, whose sole profession and focus in the professional side in life is cybersecurity, would actually be a good thing for them, a positive versus a negative. And proactivity, being proactive in reaching out before you get a call from a CFO, a CIO, a COO, or a CEO, or a board member, you as the CISO, being proactive, not just on implementing tools, but working with a partner, whether it's cybersecurity or someone else that you trust, on an ongoing basis. The continuity, the ongoing basis are critical here. And having this ability to get input from someone from a very professional team that has a community of ethical hackers behind it is a very, very powerful approach. And so I would encourage everyone to consider it and move forward in implementing such a strategy and approach before a breach happens, or God forbid, any exit is unsuccessful because of cybersecurity issues.
Okay, Petter, any final thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, if I can give some advice to if there's any heads of security or security analysts or CISOs out there, I think a couple of things that I see across the portfolio. Number one is to be able to clearly articulate the priorities that you have and tie this to the financial exposure that you have. Really work on that ability to quantify risk and get your company to be good. In these terms, this would mean become good at identity. It's actually fairly cheap to do it well, and that would help set the scene and I think help bring the others in. Because end of the day, as you said, security is not a set of tools and so on, right? It's a capability in the organization and a teamwork between a lot of different areas to become good. And being able to quantify that risk and then be very clear about what risks are we mitigating, what are the risks that we transfer with cyber insurance, and what are the ones that we accept. And I would say the second thing that I see where I think the industry is sort of suffering from as a whole is a bit telling everybody how bad everything is all the time, right? And hitting people over the head for making mistakes or blaming employees and so on, and so negativity and scare around these things, right? Let's everybody does much better if you're able to share this is what we've improved, right? It's very easy to forget that because we're also all making progress and help each other out, right? So that would be my second input. Back to you, John.
Okay, with that, we're just about out of time. Petter did hit on one of the sort of the third key thing we heard back from boards when SANS did our work and talking with boards. And that third thing was security teams are great about talking about blood in the streets and scary scenarios, but they're really weak on strategies for avoiding blood in the streets. So we really don't, imagine if a business manager came in and said, oh, people might die if they eat or drink our product or this new soda. Obviously, that's not the way to sell getting an investment in the new product. So that was a key point, I think, very good. We have to show how we enable business goals, not how we just prevent possible bad things from happening. So I want to leave the audience with some resources to get additional information. There's a threat hunting survey we did recently, and also a white paper. That same URL will get you to a white paper on third-party risk management. That's a sort of related topic. For our US audience, there's a key initiative SANS is invested in to help get new people, younger people into the cybersecurity world in the field called CyberStart. That's the US URL. There's also efforts in the UK and Dubai and other countries popping up where you'll see links there as well. There's Security's URL to get more information from them on their services and products. If you are watching a recorded version of this webinar or I just didn't get to your question, send it to q@sans.org and we'll get the right person to give you the right answer. There's my email address if you want to contact me as well. So with that, thanks for the time you spent with us, and let me turn it over to Carol for any final words.
All right, thank you so much, John, Ruben, Iran, and Petter for your great presentation, and to Security for sponsoring this webcast, which helps bring this content to the SANS community. To our audience, we greatly appreciate you listening in. For a schedule of all upcoming and archived SANS webcasts, including this one, please visit sans.org/webcasts. Until next time, take care, and we hope to have you back again for the next SANS webcast.
Thank you.